So, my name's Gareth Phillips. I'm the head of forestry development at Scottish Forestry. So, as my colleague Neil there just alluded to, we are the other half of what is formerly Forestry Commission. So, Scottish Forestry is the Scottish Government's forestry advisor and regulator. So, we predominantly deal with the regulation of felling and the enforcement of the sort of statutory obligations, enforcement of the UK forestry standard, ensuring that woodland is managed and created in a sustainable way. But a big part of our remit is woodland creation. So this is part of the government's drive to plant a significant proportion of Scotland each year. So this year our target was 13,000 hectares, and we have met that target. We've approved 13,000 hectares of new planting this year, and that target's rising up to 18,000 hectares by 2025. So lots of work to do, and our role in that is really just facilitating and trying to ensure that any woodland that's coming in and being planted is being done in a sustainable way. So this presentation is, I suppose, less about managing an existing woodland, but more about whether if there's a piece of land that might be available for communities, perhaps a piece of common good land that might be available, or whether it's purchased off a large landowner or the likes of FLS, the sort of woodland creation process around that and how you might plan that woodland and create that woodland. So I won't touch on existing woodlands, which is typically where many community woodlands get into it, where they'll purchase an existing woodland off a large landowner or public landowner like Forestry and Land Scotland. So the first thing to think about, I couldn't decide which slide to put first, whether it be this one or the next one, because both inform each other. It was a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. So I've settled with this first. So where do you start if you have a piece of land and you want to think about planting a new woodland? So the best thing really is to set objectives, and that's really just to sit down and think as a group. I'm assuming you'll have some kind of community company, and just really think about what it is that you want out of that woodland. And this is really helpful because it provides a way to sort of benchmark any of your future decisions against, to ensure that everything you're doing is really working towards that objective. This obviously helps with stakeholder engagement. It lets people, it's a great way to communicate your ideas with people, get people on board, hopefully, or not. And they may get on board for a different reason because they think it should be doing something else, but that's all good, having that input. So what are your goals? You know, what's the objective? Is it biodiversity? Is it amenity? Is it productivity? You know, do you want to make some money out of it? Is it all of the above? It can be difficult to balance all of these. However, if you've got the right site, it's not impossible. And really just thinking about, when you're setting objectives, the wider context of your site and where it sits, because it's going to be very difficult. If you've got a really remote piece of ground, it's difficult to access. Typically not your community woodlands. Usually they're woodlands in and around towns. But you've really got to think about, if one of your primary objectives is to make a lot of money and you want to plant, say, productive conifers, but the access is very restricted, you're not going to be able to get heavy vehicles in and out of the woodland, it's likely that might not be suitable. Your objectives are also going to assist you in determining which grant options are available. So there are forestry grants available under what is currently called the Forestry Grant Scheme. And these grant rates are quite favourable. So I haven't put anything in here specifically about rates because, as much as I know people love seeing pages just full of numbers, I thought it's maybe a bit heavy for a Saturday. And then at the bottom there, just as an example, conifer is your typical productivity. Native trees such as birch, native broadleaves, are normally what you would choose for biodiversity if that's your objective. But I say normally because native doesn't necessarily mean it isn't productive. Productive birch woods and Scots pine woods, these kind of things are quite commonplace, and actually I would encourage that. So next, stakeholder engagement. Again, you could say this would come before objectives or after, arguably. So really one of the main things when you're thinking about planning a woodland is speaking to people. You know, I can't stress this enough. It's so important to get people on board, speak to neighbors, people who live nearby, you know, whether it's directly adjacent to a site you might be looking at planting, or whether, you know, just the wider community councils. It's really great to get a breadth of views when you're trying to establish a new woodland, and just ensuring that you capture everyone's wants and needs. Obviously, it's impossible to cater for everybody, but things like, you know, if you've got members of the community who've been around for a long time, you may be surprised that, for example, what looks like a small divot on the ground, they might say, well, actually, that was a, you know, a curling pond, and that was a really, you know, historically, that's really important to this area. And you might say, well, okay, well, we'll incorporate that into the design and work around it. So those are the kind of things you might just find that certain people who you might even consider to sort of formally engage might actually provide some really good data and information to help you plan your woodland. And obviously buy-in is really important. Having dealt with a few community woodlands that are up and running and established, it's really important that you get the buy-in of everyone involved, just because I've seen what can happen if you get groups falling out, or people who feel like they've been left out of the loop in it and bringing up issues later on, and it can really bog down processes and trying to really you know, establish a well-run, slick operation when you've got a community woodland. And finally, might alter or amend your objectives. Again, chicken and egg. So people might raise things that make you think, oh, well, actually, let's take this in a slightly different direction than we'd thought of originally. So knowing your site, this is an important part. I appreciate that, you know, some people who want to get involved in a community woodland might not be your typical sort of land-based or land sector employed folk, you know, outdoorsy people. Might not know how to dig a soil pit and identify soil types. Totally forgivable. It's quite niche. But knowing your site is really important. So if you need to, part of woodland creation and the silviculture of growing trees, it's really important to understand what soils you have, you know, the wetness of the ground, all of these ground conditions, because that's really going to affect the kind of trees that you can grow. And if you don't have experience in that process, it's possible to learn. There's a lot of literature out there for sure, but it may well be that you're just better off employing a forestry professional who's already in the industry, and they can really help you with that. So a couple of some examples here. Location. Is it accessible to people, or is it accessible for intervention? And by intervention, I mean what I mentioned before. If it's about productivity, it's likely that you're going to need to get in and out of that wood on a fairly regular basis to make sure that you can get machinery in and out, or timber out when it's being thinned and things. Apologies if I'm using lots of jargon. Feel free to ask me any questions on any of that at the end if you like. And then next, desk research. There's a wealth of information available online. So Scotland's Land Information Search is one of a really useful tool in identifying things like environmental designations, archaeology. Our own Scottish Forestry web browser offers information on climate data, what we call ecological site classification. So that's looking at sort of broad climatic data and matching tree species to it. So that can give you a little bit of an idea of what tree species might be suitable where you want to where you're wanting to plant. And of course, utilities. This is really important, making sure that you're not planting a woodland over, you know, a large pipeline or anything like that, which could cause serious problems. And then field research, as I mentioned, ground conditions, particularly the water environment. You've got to be really careful that you're not going to end up causing pollution incidents, and making sure that it's not going to have an adverse effect on the water environment. So, and really getting out on the ground and just having a look around. So anything not flagged by desk research, archaeological data online. There's a good records, especially of scheduled monuments, but unscheduled archaeology, you can come across that just about anywhere. So it's really important to get out, have a stomp around, and if you notice anything that doesn't quite look right, whether that's then or further down the line when you're starting to break ground, then it's really important just to make sure that's noted. So woodland design, touching on this, it's really important just to consider the sort of the wider landscape in which you're designing your woodland. You know, we really try to avoid people putting in your sort of harsh edged, sort of typically what was planted back in perhaps the 70s, where you've got these big hard edged conifer blocks and that kind of stand out from the landscape, don't really complement the landscape. And this comes down to things like scale, shape. So it's really important to just think about these things when you're designing your landscape. The image there on the right is an example from one of our pieces of literature, which is Design Techniques for Forest Management Planning. It's quite a large document, but really comprehensive. So if you're thinking about it, it's a great piece of literature to read, and really helps you get through the process of thinking about how you design a woodland. And you can see here, this is an analysis that's been carried out looking at the features that are on the ground and how you might be able to work in a new woodland among them. Woodland design obviously will be affected by your objectives. You know, as I mentioned before, if it's just for biodiversity and amenity, the design of the woodland will probably be substantially different to how you might plant a productive woodland that might be sort of lots of rows of trees, less sort of clumped and sparser areas. If you're wanting to maximize productivity, that would be the way that you would typically go. But if it's biodiversity and amenity, you might be able to create a little bit more varied woodland with open areas, glades, these kind of things that are throughout it. So that's going to make a difference with your woodland design. So applying for grant funding, as I said, there's grant funding available. It's open all year round. So if it's something you're interested in, if you haven't got experience in it, as I said, it's not to say that you can't do it. There's enough literature out there, I hope, that will enable people to apply for woodland creation grant funding without necessarily needing to employ a professional forester. However, if you're starting from scratch, it's probably a good idea to get a forestry professional on board just to really go through the process with you. Most are very experienced in this and will be a big help. And just to let you know, from planning to planting, even for a very small woodland, can take upwards of 6 months. And once you get into sort of larger scale woodlands, they can take potentially 12 plus months, depending on the sensitivity. If it's a really straightforward site, no sensitivities, hopefully we can get that through really quickly. But from the point of view of you taking the first step and all the planning before even thinking about putting in an application can take months of work. So it's not to be sniffed at. So these are must reads, I would say, if you're thinking about woodland creation. So 3 key documents. Please ignore the top 2. We haven't managed to get them rebranded yet. Unfortunately, we're still working through our back catalogue. So we've got the woodland creation application guidance. That's really going through the process of woodland creation and applying for woodland creation grants. And then the supporting information, which is the one on the top right there. And that's just giving even more information on the process. So really good documents. And then the one below, preparing woodland creation applications, a guide for land managers. So that was my team that produced this. Part of our remit is producing or trying to create ways to make forestry more accessible to our stakeholders. So this was a new walkthrough guide that we published just a few months ago. And it takes you through a step-by-step guide of how to create a new woodland, hopefully in a fairly simplistic way, predominantly aimed at small woodlands, non-sensitive woodlands. It gives the broad steps, but obviously if the more sensitive or larger a woodland can be, it can just take a bit longer and there may be additional steps, but hopefully that's really helpful. And all these can be found on our website, which is forestry.gov.scot. I put questions here, but they'll be for the end. I just wanted to put my email address up there. I predominantly work in development, hence the job title. So I'm not on the sort of the operational side anymore. So any queries sort of relating to sort of directly to that aspect of the business, I probably can't answer, but I'd be more than happy if you've got a question that you either don't want to put your hand up today or feel a bit nervous about it, please feel free to drop me an email. And if I can't answer it, I'll pass it on to somebody, hopefully, who can. And that's me. So thank you for your time. I think I'll be passing over to Alan Carter, who's going to talk about planning community green spaces.